There's been a renewed push for the death penalty for convicted terrorists in the Knesset. But instead of serious discussion about the underlying issues, headlines, of course, zeroed in on the theatrics of Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who, along with others from his party, wore a noose-shaped pin. Catnip to the press, catnip to the opposition, and lots of grandstanding to the base. But that political posturing and the shallow coverage that followed distracts from the profound legal, moral, and security debate that we actually need to have. So I invite you to think this through with me today. Let's talk about the context, the law, the claims on either side, and then just a little bit about this specific bill. I'm Aylana Diamant, Executive Director of the Israel Law and Liberty Forum, and this is Basic Law. Let's look at the context. What would you do if you lived utterly surrounded by existential threat? Because despite the normal pacing of life in Israel, our vibrant cities and our layers of history, and our crowded beaches with the most annoying version of beach tennis known to man, there's another reality that runs beneath it all. Over the years, we've lost far too many men, women, and children to jihadist terror groups that glorify death and seek the destruction of the Jewish people, the Jewish state, and its citizens. Now, just to feel the scale, according to Jewish Virtual Library, between 1993 and 2000, the Oslo years, nearly 300 Israelis were murdered in terror attacks. Between 2000 and 2005, during the Al-Aqsa Intifada, yes, the same Intifada that so many want to globalize, 1,100 Israelis were killed. Hundreds more have been killed since, thousands wounded, and that is not counting those that we lost on October 7th. It's also not counting the attacks that are foiled or which fail each year. So here's an example. Per Shin Bet figures cited by the INSS, in 2024, there were 6,828 terror attacks. Of those, 231 were car rammings, shootings, stabbings, and bombs. And that same year, the Shin Bet stopped over 1,000 attacks. So the question of how to deter terror as a phenomenon, and not just individual attacks, is a top public priority. And after October 7th, many Israelis feel that despite the incredible courage and sacrifice of our security forces, the deterrence model is still not up to snuff. For some, the death penalty seems like a possible answer. So let's talk about that. What's the history of this issue in Israel already? Because capital punishment exists in Israeli criminal law. It was inherited from the British Mandate. But early on, Israel sharply limited its application and almost never used it. Now, it applies for a few offenses: genocide and crimes against humanity, against Nazis and their collaborators, and against treason-related offenses under the Penal Code. The catch is that for treason, the act has to be committed during wartime. So, while terrorists who murdered on October 7th could theoretically be executed under this provision, non-wartime terrorists are usually tried as murderers and receive life sentences. Here's a terrible example. Take Hamas terrorist Abbas al-Sayed. He planned the Sharon Mall attack in 2001, murdering 35 Israelis and wounding hundreds more. He was also responsible for the 2002 Park Hotel bombing, 30 killed, 140 wounded. He received 35 consecutive life sentences. And by the way, Hamas demanded his release in recent deals, but thankfully, that demand was denied. Okay, so that's Israeli criminal law. Judea and Samaria has 3 overlapping legal regimes: Jordanian, mandatory, and Israeli military legislation, and capital punishment exists under each for different offenses. Still, and this is the bottom line, every time a military court did hand down a death sentence in the past, it was overturned on appeal. And the rationale for that was that such an extraordinary punishment has to be specifically requested by the prosecution or by government directive, and that hasn't happened. Israel has the death penalty for certain offenses and never uses it. So now the question is, why? Well, the reasons are complex. Now, some arguments against it mirror what you find in global debates. Opponents call it inhumane, immoral, unpopular internationally, and according to some research, It's not the most effective as a deterrent. But in Israel, the opposition has even deeper layers. So first, even though a majority of Israelis do support imposing the death penalty for terrorists in principle, for many it's extremely hard to stomach emotionally. In the Israeli psyche, death by hanging evokes historical trauma, from the British hanging members of the Jewish underground during the Mandate, and from the early years of the state, one of the 2 times in which Israel applied the death penalty against someone who was later exonerated. And while Jewish law includes capital punishment, the rabbinic tradition weighs heavily against carrying it out, which matters for religious parties. But most importantly, Israel is a society that sanctifies life, even under impossible circumstances. Now, that self-perception is central to who we are, and it's all the more crucial when starkly contrasted against the jihadist death cults that we have to fight. This is a struggle that Israel lives with alone in the Western world. But look, even if Israelis agreed to impose the death penalty on terrorists convicted of murder, how many times a year would the public bear the weight of executing someone who no longer poses an imminent threat? Was it once? 5 times? 10 times? Could Israeli society handle it? Then there are the strategic implications. Now, pursuing the death penalty pushes against the government's pattern of releasing dozens or hundreds of terrorists to bring home kidnapped Israeli civilians. The death penalty takes that bargaining chip off the table, and that's a principle that many support, though the governments have not upheld it consistently. Beyond that, for years, part of the security establishment warned that imposing the death penalty could inspire more violence rather than deter it. October 7th marked a sea change in this thinking, and the Shabak, or Shin Bet, or Israeli Security Agency, recently rejected that assumption in testimony about the bill under question this week. Okay, so now that's the opposition. What about those who support the death penalty? Well, they see it as one tool among many to punish the murderers of Israeli civilians and to deter future attacks. Now, they argue that even if evidence on deterrence is inconclusive for violent crime globally, the effect really has not been tested for terror offenses. And they note that while Jewish tradition was cautious in applying the death penalty, it was unequivocal about confronting external threats to the collective. Beyond that, they stress that our ongoing practice of releasing terrorists to secure the return of kidnapped or murdered Israelis has created a barbaric incentive, one that has ultimately cost Israeli life. Now, whether you agree with that or not, the claim isn't made up out of thin air. Israel has freed thousands of convicted terrorists in prisoner exchanges for both living and deceased captives, and in the moment, we feel a visceral duty to bring our people home. But you turn around and you see that the track record of these deals has frankly been a disaster. Now, the most infamous example, of course, is the Gilad Shalit deal. Israel released over 1,000 prisoners, including 280 who were serving life sentences, in exchange for one kidnapped IDF soldier. Yahya Sinwar, the architect of October 7th, was among those released. And of the 1,027 set free, an estimated 82% returned to terrorism and 15% carried out or planned attacks themselves. Now, the pattern goes back further. In 1985, Israel released 1,150 terrorists for 3 soldiers captured by the PFLP during the First Lebanon War. Among those freed was Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, a Muslim Brotherhood cleric who became Hamas's spiritual leader. Every prisoner release has freed terrorists who murdered Israelis, sending them back into the arms of their communities and their organizations. And their sentences, like 35 life terms, have become symbolic. Some learned Hebrew in jail, some earned advanced degrees in prison. They returned to families receiving monthly stipends as rewards for terrorism. And then too often, as we saw with the Shalit deal, they return to the work of killing Israelis. And so people who support the death penalty say, is that justice for the victims that we've already lost? And what about the victims who are yet to lose their lives? What message does this send to terrorists incubating in the jihadi movements that we confront daily about the low, low price of Israeli blood. With the best of intentions in the hardest of circumstances, have we not helped create the very tragedy that we're trying to prevent? So that's the case. Supporters of the death penalty argue that this cycle has to end and that it's a moral imperative. I have to say that after October 7th, that logic is also resonating more widely within the Israeli public. Now, bills to implement the death penalty have been introduced over 20 times in the past. Most went nowhere. This particular bill has made it farther than others, even though it is unlikely to pass in its current form. What does it say? It makes the death penalty mandatory for causing the death of an Israeli citizen, purposefully or negligently, when that act is motivated by racial hostility or hostility toward the public, with the aim of harming the state of Israel and the revival of the Jewish people in its homeland. It also tries to apply that standard in Judea and Samaria and removes a previous requirement for a unanimous judicial decision to impose the death sentence. Now, honestly, criticism of the text itself has come not only from opponents of the idea, but also from supporters of the overall agenda. Some argue that the language is too broad, others argue that it can't be applied evenly, and others say that proving nationalistic motivations sets a messy and difficult legal threshold to be proven. So the text is highly likely to be revised before the bill advances, if it does so. For that reason, talking about its finest details right now is, in my view, a bit premature. It's good for business if you're into clickbait or scoring political points, but not necessarily accurate as far as whatever final product might emerge. Now, if the bill passes, it will almost certainly face a legal challenge and could easily be struck down, a move which will bolster the opposing narratives in a culture war in which the legal system is now a focus. Then again, whether the bill is even meant to pass or simply force a political showdown on a hot topic before an election year is a fair question for any close observer of Israeli politics. Now, when you have a bill that's written to signal or wink at a specific Israeli base, the writer is not always considering how it will sound when translated to English and stripped of context. To get the full story, we're going to have to wait. But what should interest us more is the problem that the bill is trying to address, and that so many others have tried to before. How can the state of Israel best secure its citizens against a threat whose depravity is unmatched anywhere else in the Western world? It's yet another crucial debate handed down to our generation. May we bear it responsibly. Thanks for your time, and see you next week.